All right, we'll go ahead and get underway here. Cool. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the do's and don'ts of implementing a zero trust architecture. I'm Jack McFarland, account executive, federal account executive here with ActiveNav, and I will be the moderator for today. Before we begin, just wanted to go through a couple quick housekeeping items. So we are scheduled for a 1-hour session today, and we'd like to keep it as close to the time frame allotted. So we'll be wrapping up around noon Eastern time. The webinar will be recorded, and we will be distributing a link to those who signed up for the webinar via email. So keep an eye on your inboxes, as that should be sent over to you following today, or more likely tomorrow. Regarding questions, we highly encourage everybody to ask questions in the chat provided below. We have about 10 to 15 minutes allotted for a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Also, any pressing questions that might be asked in the chat can be answered immediately. Without further ado, because we're all so excited for today's webinar, I just wanted to be sure to give Rich the full time allotted. So I'll go ahead and pass the mic over to Rich Hale, ActiveNav's Chief Technology Officer. Rich?
Hey, Jack, and thank you. How's my audio today?
You sound great.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. I'm very pleased to meet you virtually. At this webinar, I'm going to talk about data discovery and thinking of this really as a high-level playbook and that playbook's place in zero trust architecture. As described in this year's Executive Memorandum in 2209. And in some ways, at a high level, there's a playbook here, which I'll move through, but also implicitly a series of do's and don'ts of data discovery as well. So first, let's just give myself a decent introduction. As Jack said, my name is Rich Hale. I'm ActiveNav's CTO. And I have an ex-military background, as you can tell from my accent, perhaps. I'm from the United Kingdom, England, and I first got into information and data in the Royal Air Force Headquarters Air. That's a formation responsible for the coordination of all of the Royal Air Force's air assets across the world. And I was concerned with data governance as part of a global network transformation. Now, global network transformations are really a part of the scenery these days. But as ever, a network transformation is one opportunity where organizations can consider the nature of their data, how they best protect it, and often get pulled into the idea of how can I do anything with my data unless I understand it. And that really is the heart of what I'll be talking about today. And I think the heart of a ZTA playbook, how can you apply policy and protect data with zero trust unless you understand the context and what that data really is. So in the Air Force, my scope involved over 700,000 people across global locations. And like many such ventures, the technical implementation challenges rapidly eclipsed any government imperatives. And certainly back then, this was back in 2005, so some time ago, and the technical implementation, the technical issues, I think, were bigger than they are today, albeit that the scope of data has grown so much. We've brought on so many new technologies that make this possible and viable in a way that I think the memorandum captures really well. That notwithstanding, data governance at any scale has always been hard. Quite rightly, back in the day when I was involved in this with the Air Force, we focused on the governance of very specific streams of data products. For example, in operational planning, when we deploy overseas, how do we manage the data around preparing for that deployment, getting into the right assets in place and reflecting and being ready to prosecute in theatre. In understanding how we manage products and decision-making around sensor to shoot to kill changes, or maybe the preparation of intelligent products. And across agencies in the US, in the US federal market, there are, of course, a plethora of additional prepared products. We did this back then because the focus on specific products and processes provided the context critical to make decisions. And frankly, the technology couldn't scale to anything bigger. And so that became the imperative. Look after these key products, look after these key processes. And that remained the imperative until really things like the new memorandum as released. And I'm really pleased to say how the memorandum has changed that. Because back then, I was frustrated. I was frustrated that we were forced to pretty much ignore what I felt was the lion's share of our data, which continued to grow inexorably. These days, so much has changed. As breach has become all but inevitable, I'm pleased to be here to be discussing a piece of policy that explicitly makes that no longer the case. In this webinar, therefore, I'm going to look at that playbook and explore the practical implementations of M2209 and Zero Trust architecture as it relates to data discovery, as what I think is a key foundation for moving towards that Zero Trust cybersecurity principle and framework. A quick anecdote here, really. I think it sets the scene quite well. You know, we've sold to a range of federal customers, and I'll not forget the customer where we did a proof of concept, which is part of our approach to allow customers to try our software on their data. A really well-known agency who I won't name. We went in and we found some unexpected sensitive data. And that POC was shut down, and we were politely asked to leave the room. That's a sort of a head in the sands type approach, which, while I understand, I think this new memorandum and the Zero Trust principles make that untenable. You know, think about it as a lawyer having plausible deniability. Well, I don't think that's the case. I don't think plausible deniability is acceptable anymore. I don't think it ever was acceptable, but these days I think the memorandum makes that really clear, and ZTA requires it. And so, you know, fundamentally, I see this as about knowing your data, because at its heart, data cannot be effectively protected unless it is properly understood. So very, very quickly, a quick introduction to who we are. ActiveNav, we're a software vendor with a range of expert services as well. We pride ourselves on the practical experience we've won in data discovery in organizations, and the fact that our software has been specifically built to be a key component to enable organizations to know their data. So, of course, they can better govern it. And I think in the context of ZTA, governing it enables you to consistently apply that Zero Trust principle across your data assets. Our customers come in all shapes and sizes from all sectors. And of course, pertinent to discussion, I think it's worth just pointing out and highlighting our experience with a range of government entities in discovering and classifying data for a range of governance use cases. A couple of new examples that don't appear on this slide today. The NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they purchased our software for records management and compliance, and to provide insight. I think they were very foresightful here. They recognized they had no visibility into their shared drives, their SharePoint, and their FileNet environment. And so having purchased the software, particularly on a records compliance perspective, they recognized very quickly they could repurpose the insights that our capability provided them to support their Zero Trust approach. And they've been going through a full process of disposing of unnecessary data as well as protecting it, and dealing with the challenges of doing this in a highly classified and highly controlled environment, as we know, and also the obligations to maintain appropriately records for more than 100 years. An alternative would be something like the DOT OIG, and their responsibility to ensure that the big agency doesn't abuse its power by investigating fraud and spending and the like. And again, they took a records management approach and cybersecurity approach to discover and tag their sensitive data so that they could better protect it. And these really are the fundamental principles about Zero Trust and the executive memorandum comes out. So enough about us. Let me kind of talk now about this playbook. I've often been accused as potentially overcomplicating some of my statements and presentations, so I thought we'd start with something really basic. And I really like the way the memorandum describes in its approach to Zero Trust CISA's 5 pillars. And I like them because they pull out specifically this 5th pillar in data. I often think about organizations having a very traditional approach to security and focusing on the first 3 pillars, things like identity, devices, and networks. And occasionally I would suggest the 4th pillar, but essentially making sure that they do the obvious things like bolting the doors, making sure that ingress and egress is protected in pretty broad sweeps. ZTA requires organizations to take a further and more sophisticated approach, and it says in the memorandum and under CISA's pillars to talk about you making the use of data categorization. The new memorandum in 2209 in addressing zero trust architecture takes this a little bit further and goes from categorization and talks about discovery, classification, and order to protect. I think it fills out the pillars a little bit and really sets out and stands out this clear requirement to know your data. And I think about discovery, how finding your data, the clear implication being that organizations don't necessarily know where all their data is, let alone know what it is. And I don't think I've ever seen this degree of clarity. In addition, the memorandum opens up the scope in looking at ZTA and talks about broadening beyond just applications and these top-level products, and talks about things like supporting data sets, and even considers documentation, document collaboration environments, and email. And then it goes even further, and I think this is great. It talks about not only data scope and therefore discovering your data and understanding its characteristics, but it talks about the practical issues and touches on the practical issues of classification and the practical issues of automation and handling the false positives that comes with these sorts of journeys. As an example, I'll take a moment now to just indulge myself a little and talk about a thing that's a little bit close to my heart here, which is what I think is the misuse of the term classification. And I think this is really consistent with the federal government's approach to ZTA. Market commentary has traditionally been, I think, about talking about classification as being explicitly applying a label to a data object, such as a file. That is, writing the classification into the file. And I kind of get it, but I've always felt that to be inappropriate. The classification is about deriving the nature of that file, actually working out how to classify it. And that's the important, obvious first step before one applies that label. The premium being discovering the data, understanding the data you have, deriving that classification so that you can apply the most appropriate policy-driven disposal and protection for that data. And I think disposal and protection are two parts of the game here. If you minimize and remove data that's not needed, then of course you didn't spend money and time protecting it. And then of course, once you've identified and appropriately characterized that data, you can apply your zero trust approach to it. So classification, for the purposes I'm talking about here, and I think in the context of the memorandum and the approach to ZTA, is deriving the nature of discovered data. And that's the bit that really matters. Then you can make the right choices about how you protect it and manage it. I think there's another point here, and I'll put it up on the screen. I want to make the point here that users can't be trusted to classify data. This isn't really meant to, it's absolutely not meant as a slight on those users. Rather, I think it's a reality check. The trend in many technologies has been to introduce workflows that pass the buck onto the user to label data. While, of course, one might argue that users know the most about that data, users are very, very individually centered and necessarily show they've got work to do. And so, yeah, in our experience, and I think it's an emerging understanding, forcing classification into the end user workflow invariably results in failures in the general case. It doesn't mean that users can't do the job, but in the general case, users need better support. I think this leads to the fact that much data is completely unknown, not only the data that users are creating today, but the legacy data or the data that's being stored in organizations, which proposes a particular risk. And traditional approaches from the first three pillars, managing identity, protecting devices and managing networks, have completely ignored understanding that data. So there's a huge gap there. And lastly, is that the implication very clearly of zero trust is that we don't trust our users. That's a good, sound security principle. So we're talking about data discovery and classification as a way of supporting and enabling our users and really not getting in the way of their workflow so that we can protect the data with a corporate perspective. This sets the scene really for some important points I'll make later on, and particularly the determination of what data to classify and how that becomes critical. A small diversion here, though. A little bit of humor from me in this slide. It often draws consternation, but I like it because it challenges to think about the maturity of organizations and how one travels on this sort of journey. It's one of my CEO's favorites, and he describes this as the competency matrix. Competency matrix is about the maturity of an organization. Or an agency, and of course the case of the federal government. On the vertical side of this 2x2 matrix, we can talk about whether an organization understands, is conscious of the state of its data, or whether it's unconscious, whether it doesn't really understand the state of its data. And then on the horizontal axis, we talk about the organization's ability to manage and address that state. And I think it has an analogy to data discovery overall. Of course, as is the way with a 2x2 matrix, there are 4 contexts to be considered. And I think these illustrate the journey, part of the ZTA journey, and particularly the journey that you'll encounter as you go through a data discovery playbook. In the bottom right, we have the unconsciously competent organization. That is an organization that doesn't know that it's got a problem, but nevertheless is competent. We can all agree that's a lucky coincidence and is unsustainable. It's fortunate maybe, but the reality is that what makes it unsustainable is the organization's kind of looking after the problem by accident. We may well fall out of this state without realizing it and become unconsciously competent. I think that the evidence is that many organizations are in the unconsciously incompetent state. That is, they don't have processes in place to address the data problem because they haven't understood the data problem. I think particularly this is the case with some of the new scope that the executive memorandum introduces around supporting data sets, but it can be around other data products as well. I think in order to begin a journey to ZTA, one needs to first understand that you're unconsciously incompetent, and I think the principles that are laid out in the memorandum start to talk about that. And one needs to take a conscious effort to move the organization's position. So the first step really is in understanding your data. And the clear implication of doing that is understanding your data and assessing the gaps and issues so that you recognize the state you're in. First step on the journey to maturity. And I think the memorandum and being in a ZTA state is a progress which essentially needs to end up in a situation where you are consciously competent, and you're managing a sustained plan to prioritize and address the problems in your data, whichever product, whichever data repository, whichever environment we're describing. And there's an investment required to move on this journey and get to this level of maturity. I think it's really important when we're talking about the data pillar from CISA's 5 pillars, that moving into this conscious state is critical, but also that you don't have to address all of the problems immediately. There's clearly our experience, my apologies, I'm moving too quickly. There we go. Our clear experience is that self-evidently you can't apply zero trust until you understand these gaps and move on that journey. And also not all data is created equal. So you need to sort of prioritize and manage the issues that come out. It's our experience that most organizations, when they go on a data discovery exercise, particularly in supporting data sets around email and document collaboration, find a plethora of issues. And then they need to establish a plan that enables them to address those gaps. So, and I'll talk about types of data and where this is most applicable in a minute. But once you become competent, you then have the fighting chance of being able to go on a journey, address the shortfalls, and move along this maturity journey. Fundamentally, ZTA is about managing the information state as part of an overall governance program based upon an understanding of the actual state of the data, the information, what happens on the ground, rather than some imagined state. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide, but I want to stress it. Users are under pressure to get work done. Users take shortcuts, users innovate. And in certain data sets, this leads to divergence between, considerable divergence between what data the organization believes is in a given repository environment and what is actually there. And so recognizing this gap at the first instance, that the file share in the corner, email and the like are all being, from an organizational perspective, misused, and perhaps with the best intent misused, it is really critical so that one invests appropriately in data discovery, and that's what M2209 brings out, the fact that one needs to discover, so that one can understand the actual state of data. So this leads us on to this discussion, what's data rich? I made the point up front that traditionally, and I use the term traditionally, in the past when I first got involved in this, and up until a few years ago, I was presenting at a webinar, a federal webinar, talking about data mapping. The point here being that organizations are focused on particular products and particular contexts because that's achievable and the technology is available to support it. So one of the really important steps within 2209 is the recognition of the need to broaden one's understanding of the scope of data that needs to be protected and hence discovered. Again, implicitly here, the need to discover because one does not know not only what the data is, but more importantly, where it even is. And so one needs to get a grip of what that data is and discover it. And I like to quote, I'm going to quote the words from M2209 here, because I think they're really quite nice, organizations begin to start grappling with more loosely structured and dispersed data systems, such as email and document collaboration. And I think, this presents the important point for me, one of the really important changes of scope in this approach to ZTA. As I said before, approaches have been traditionally limited to processes and streams or particular products. The new directive recognizes that on a journey to ZTA, that's no longer sufficient. And specifically, it points out that any organization's data assets include a range of much more predictable data environments. It's an oversimplification, but the potential scope of data runs on this from two extremes on this continuum. On the left-hand side, the structured data environment, and on the right, an unstructured data environment. It's a continuum, and all data lies somewhere on this continuum. And you've got semi-structured and a range of others. But let's not overcomplicate it right now, because I want to illustrate the extremes in this playbook. There's a clear difference here between application level discovery and the fact that those applications, the packaged data sets, there's a typo on my slide there that says packages data sets, it should say packaged data sets, are very much easier to discover. They have an inherent knownness. And they're also very closely aligned to a process. That means we're far more likely to know inherently what's in there. And traditionally, a top-down inventory and mapping process has been adequate to identify what's in that data and satisfy the need to apply protection to it. Importantly, because these data sets are bound to products and processes, there's a limited user freedom, and there's a really high context to this data. One gets a real sense of what one can know really quite early on by examining the processes, the nature of the data. The clear contrast that the new executive order brings out in 2209 is that one needs, as I said, to start grappling with things like email and document collaboration. And that brings us down to the thorny challenge of unstructured data, and data in really very challenging to control environments. Indeed, these environments, such as document collaboration, your SharePoint, your Box, your Google Workspace Drive, and things like that. Email, to a great extent, chat, are incredibly difficult to control in detail. And more importantly, the vendors are pains to increase the flexibility that users have in these environments so that they can innovate. Users continue to find new ways to use these environments themselves. And so there's a high user freedom, very little context. That means, and that draws us to one very clear conclusion, and really reiterating again what the memorandum says. This greater user freedom to operate in a repository, the less likely it is that one can predict or know what data is actually present. Users are doing their best to get their job day-to-day done, and the reality is that if one attacks or considers any given file share, any given SharePoint site or whatever, there's a good chance that you won't actually know what data is inside. This leads us to the very key conclusion of our playbook, but one needs to look at a bottom-up inventory in contrast to a top-down inventory. That means using technology and approaches that actually discovers the specific data that's in the environment, and then keeping that evergreen. When thinking about this data, one needs to recognize that it changes rapidly. Not only does it change as users interact with it, but also as organizations change, as data is merged, as IT moves information around, as new organizations are created and spun out or acquired, that data changes all the time. And that leads to a need to create and maintain this bottom-up inventory and keep it evergreen. The inventory itself describes what's actually present and implicitly when one considers the scale of the data being generated in the environment, the demands on the underlying technology and deployment are considerable. And I think I'd also contrast and say they're very different from top-down inventory. The approaches that need to be taken need to be far more robust and thorough. And I think this leads often to, I think necessarily to the conclusion that you need a vendor who really gets bottom-up inventory and maintenance of those to meet your zero trust needs. Keeping track of my time here, I think I'm doing okay. So let's consider the inventory itself and classification. I've said already that I'm impressed with the recognition in the recent memorandum in its description of the journey to zero trust architecture. I'm impressed with the need to their recognition to broaden data scope and to significantly expand that from constrained products and processes. That said, I'm even more impressed with the explicit recognition of some of the practicalities involved in classifying data. This is really a first, and in a way, I think of it as a vendor's dirty secret. You would be forgiven for believing that machine learning is the secret bullet here, and that machine learning problems have been cracked and solved, and therefore you just need to find a vendor with machine learning that does the job. The memorandum addresses this directly when it describes handling data for a zero trust architecture. It says things like machine learning models can be opaque and complex to refine, correct. It says that agencies must identify technologies that do not require machine learning in order to be useful. It also describes how agencies need to be implementing these technologies in report-only mode. That's an implicit implication that one needs to check before one trusts these models. That's absolutely true. And most importantly, that one doesn't let these technologies free in ways that might impact staff workflow, because one needs to spend time to ensure that the models and the implementations are appropriate. And that has a bunch of different demands, because otherwise they'll get in the way of staff. And that's particularly true of a zero trust environment where one is explicitly using these policies to influence control of access to data. So I'll say this again because I think it's really important. Machine learning is not a magical solution to the classification problem. Free automation of any technology is not appropriate, at least not in the early stages. And insertion of classification into the user workflow is very likely to have a negative impact on the users. I'll say one more time, I think this is a stunningly practical take, a necessary take. It's a breath of fresh air, and it recognizes the state of technology and the implications of that technology. It means that we're taking zero trust very seriously. I do want to say, though, machine learning has its place, and vendors must have machine learning in the roadmap and must be actively working towards using these capabilities to improve what they do. But these skills and the context needed to make them work, to train classifiers, is a really big lift for organizations. The right people are simply not present in most organizations, and especially too valuable to be applied to to data in general. The more transparent the approach is, machine learning can be very, very opaque unless one is an expert. The more transparent the classification approach is, the better chance organizations have of dealing with the results. And I think I'd like to see recognition of the need to use the term artificial intelligence, AI, rather than machine learning, which is a subset, to open up the opportunity to use a wide range of different classifiers to do the job. The memorandum makes that very clear. So let's talk about what's in this inventory and a little bit about the classification. I'll work through what is a little bit of a complicated picture here. I want to suggest that a good inventory, first of all, needs to connect to all of the relevant repositories in scope. And I think it's quite important here, as I said earlier on, your bottom-up inventory focused on these and supporting data sets, your unstructured data. You really need a specialist vendor for this place, because these capabilities are specific to doing this viably. So a good inventory will connect to and keep an evergreen watch on your selected unstructured data repositories. And it'll include some really important elements. First of all, it'll build a picture of object metadata. That is simple things like the types of data that's discovered, how old that data is, and the like. It needs to build up a picture of object context. So where is that data? Where is it stored? What's the context in which it's working? and then the features of that content. And I use the word features very specifically here, what's inside the content itself. What's quite important here is if one builds an inventory of everything, the whole thing, and essentially replicates those repositories, these inventories become unscalable and simply don't work or become too costly to maintain. So the inventory really needs to look after the content features so that it can perform well and operate in a scalable fashion. This leads then, the inventory gathering together this data, this leads to the opportunity to apply, I think, at a minimum, 2 types of classification. The first one being sensitivity. And the memorandum talks about sensitivity, and zero trust clearly requires an understanding of sensitivity. I'd like to make perhaps a slight technical point here that sensitivity needs to be based on the presence of regulated or controlled data elements. In the privacy side, it might be an employee number or a staff number. In a different product side, it might be an asset number, some sort of contract, or some sort of controlled terminology or wording. So the presence of those features is what's important. And those features can appear in all types of different documents. You can't infer a document sensitive just by looking at the record type, in my opinion. One needs to separate the 2 types of classifications. One needs to be able to both classify for information record type and determine sensitivity based upon the presence or not of controlled data elements. So this is 2 types of classification that I think an inventory needs to support, and they're complementary. The presence and the ability of your inventory to arrive at these 2 types of classification, the information record type and the sensitivity, then enables one subsequently to determine and apply policies which enable one to do things like apply protective control markings or other types of policies, such as data loss prevention policies to protect and control that data. The point I'd also make, though, is that inventory needs to provide you the opportunity to visualize what's being discovered. And I'll make the point in a following slide that the inventory has got far more utility than I'd say simply or just applying protective capabilities and under a zero trust environment. It has the opportunity to enable you to apply a range of different use cases to better leverage and control and minimize that data as well. And visualization becomes very important. It's the visualization requirement that really sets a demand on inventory technology to scale adequately. If one just pours and replicates the repository data into your inventory, it doesn't scale adequately. You can't get the relevant insights into them to make it practical. I think what I'd also say is you can then, with a good inventory, start to extend your classification environment. As I said, zero trust requires sensitivity classification. I would suggest it also really requires some capability information or record type classification. But once one builds up the competency and capability, then any inventory technology needs to be able to be adapted and extended to do things like looking at asset or task fields, dragging tasker data from the content. Looking at process fields, things that identify where content is attached to a particular process or a particular stage of a process. Maybe applying things like controlled and classified information labels, as well as things like sensitivity and information record type. And also being able to derive things like information disposal. Some of you may have heard of terms like redundant, obsolete, and trivial. These are all different ways of classifying data so that it can be disposed of in a scalable fashion. So I'd be asserting here that as part of a zero trust architecture, one needs to implement sensitivity, consider classifications that relate to information or record type, and then build a capability that enables one to extend beyond those into more value-based classification as well. Of course, knowing one's data and becoming consciously competent doesn't stop here. You need to sustain this. And so the inventory needs to provide a repeating discovery regime to complement event-based discovery as well. So it remains evergreen and continues to be an asset for the organization going forward and enables the organization to adapt as its data changes. So what other technology considerations will I talk about on part of this playbook for zero trust architecture? I like to think about these wild data sources as your key requirement here. The new memorandum identifies that organizations need to extend their scope into these more challenging environments. And I'd also like to point out that it's very challenging to find a vendor that can handle both types of environments adequately. The technology needs to be performant in its discovery and refresh because it scales adequately and it can deal with the scope of data here. And as I said, these wild data sources, these unstructured data sources, these supporting data sets are incredibly challenging to handle in a scalable fashion. I think most importantly, it needs to be usable and support a wide range of different types of classification. I've mentioned several here. The approach, the possibilities are almost endless, but a technology that simply focuses on sensitivity, I think, limits the scope and utility of an inventory. It may address immediate requirements for zero trust, but I think, frankly, it limits the organization's capability to go broader in its use cases and start to address the other elements that impact on zero trust, such as data minimization and other types of disposal approaches. The other point I need to make is, I said before, focusing on end user classification leads to challenges and makes programs often a root program failure and can cause problems downstream in user workflow. So there needs to be a visualization of user journey that enables analysts, I like to think of information professionals such as record managers, for example, or other types of analysts, to be able to engage with data at scale and just decide on how that data is disposed of. While zero trust relies on dynamic classification in many ways, there are vast swaths of data that doesn't need to be dealt with dynamically. And indeed, therefore, you need, in fact, cannot be dealt with dynamically. It needs to be addressed at scale. And a key visualization strategy and user journey for making decisions for disposal of that data is required. So what would you get out of an inventory, not beyond your zero trust objectives here? First, importantly, inventories need to be able to demonstrate and provide oversight on compliance overall. So not only provide the classifications to enable one to apply controls at an individual object or file level, but provide you an oversight of how your data is doing overall for compliance purposes against a range of different policies, sensitivity being one of them. It needs to enable and provide an off-ramp to make remediation decisions based on policies. Those policies can be driven by regulation, but also driven by internal policies too. I'd like to make the point here that in a post-breach environment, having an inventory evergreen and current is a critical asset here. The important thing here is that once the data has been breached, potentially locked down or encrypted by a threat actor, having an inventory that enables you to identify what was in that data is really a key capability that enables the organization to position its response posture. And one of the challenging things about this environment is that it takes things like a breach to bring people's focus to the table to enable them to invest in this type of data discovery technology. I would assert that really learning post-breach is one of the most expensive ways of doing that. And from a federal perspective, and from a zero trust perspective, the wrong way to learn the lesson. I mentioned earlier that users can't be trusted. Again, deep respect to users, of course, but users are required to innovate, work fast, and resolve issues with poorer technology implementations. And so they take shortcuts and they do stuff that we don't expect them to do. That can lead to information leakage and spillage, and a good evergreen inventory technology will enable you to identify things where data is leaked inappropriately into different environments. Really, that's the heart of a zero trust approach. Lastly, I think when one has the right visualization and ability for analysts, record managers like to interact with that inventory, you can start to do things like identify where new processes and new data flows have sprung up. As users start to interact with data and one identifies this leakage and spillage, the inventory and the visualization supports it, enables one to ask questions like, why did that happen? What were the user interactions that caused that spillage? Was the user coping with a technology issue, a poor integration, and just doing what felt right to them? And let me give you an example. Has the user taken two packaged data sets or some other class of application, exported data into another environment, manipulated that data environment to do something innovative, new, or something that's just not well supported, and that's led to this new process flow and the resultant spillage. And a good inventory will offer the visualization that enables one to determine that and empowers your information professionals to start to address those challenges and get ahead of the game so that one can anticipate and apply the right zero trust controls. So that really sort of gets me to the end of the playbook. I move on to a couple of comments about how we view this world. I think the one thing I've forgotten to talk about here, the graphic on the right tries to be clear. Zero trust is not just about the technology. It requires one to really get a grip around the process, people involved, and particularly when one implements an inventory to meet the requirements of 2209 and begin to address these new, more challenging data sets. Maintaining that evergreen inventory requires one to have the technology in place, but also the empower the right people in the organization, wrap the right processes around so that one can apply and gain the utility of the inventory I pointed out on the left. So I'd like to just briefly finish off with ActiveNav's take on zero trust and the utility of discovery in zero trust. And we capture it in what I really like this term here. We capture it as a need for any organization, any agency to have a vision and aspire towards having zero dark data. Now, as I said earlier on when I talked about all the data in data scope, in an application and packaged data set environment, that data is not really dark. Not only is it being used a great deal, but it's very well known. The context is clear by the processes and the use of that data. But in these new scopes, in document collaboration, in email, in chat, in these wider data environments, they really are dark. They're dark because organizations haven't governed them historically well, and they're dark because they change very rapidly and because users are free to innovate within them. And so zero dark data comes from deploying and applying the principles of discovery and classification for protection that the memorandum brings up for ZTA, but it also enables an organization to step beyond zero trust architecture and leverage more out of that data. So we've adopted this as our motto, and every day we think about working towards a future where organizations ignore exactly 0 bytes of this dark data, and they have a clear inventory, actionable inventory with the right policies in place so that they can not only protect that as part of a zero trust architecture, but that they can also leverage that data for other organizational objectives. This is a pretty complicated slide. I'm going to highlight the points here that I want to cover. This really describes how we implement an approach to discovery and classification. It's premised on the fact that dark data is in a state of continuous change. And I talk about decay as well. Data decays all the time. It gets unused, it gets put on the side, sensitive data as well. And sound governance really requires that data is understood so compliance can be measured. And this is the step to moving to the consciously incompetent stage. I've measured my data, I've discovered it, I've understood it, I now understand the gaps and I can move on to protecting it. You need to think about remediation from deletion to labeling so that you can, and that needs to be policy-based and defensible, and this enables you to apply your zero trust approach based upon those policies and the way the classification turns out. And then good governance needs to progress this, because this is often addressed and most practically addressed as a project level. Let's look at a particular repository, a particular department, or a particular agency, but one needs to progress from a project based to a sustained business as usual case. And those are important steps to get to the zero trust scope. So I'd like to sort of highlight the business impact of each of the 4 stages that we consider: discovering, deciding, acting, and sustaining. First of all, in the discovery phase, which is brought out in M2209 in its vision for zero trust architecture, the job here is to understand the compliance gap, to identify failed processes and align stakeholders around not only what data needs to be addressed, what policies need to be applied, but also where the policy gaps lie. You'll find things in your data which your policies simply don't anticipate. And that's the importance of this bottom-up approach to discovery. Second up, deciding enables you to establish a policy-based plan for action. I said before, in these collaborative, more challenging data environments, users are doing an enormous amount of novel things, and they'll come up with, you'll find things that are simply not anticipated policy. And so this part of the decision process here is taking decisions on the types of policies and the plan that supports and enables the action to be taken on this data, be that action to apply labeling or a particular trust approach to it, or simply to dispose of that data, or somewhere in between, so that the data is not retained and inappropriately managed. Acting on the data must have the option of outcome of reducing non-compliant data holdings, and there's an important outcome here. Organizations can reduce their data holdings significantly and reduce the cost of their zero trust approach. But of course, it enables one to apply both automatically, but also where required with the right user interaction in the right use workflows to establish data-driven controls. And then lastly, the sustainment of that. This requires a monitoring approach, the ability to maintain an evergreen inventory. And one needs to integrate the outcomes and the findings of that inventory with the business as usual as part of the data governance program. And that means measuring metrics on information state. How is my information doing? What is its health? As well as the ability to apply particular classifications to particular objects or files, because these two come hand in hand. How are particular objects classified so they are protected, but also how overall is my organization doing, what businesses are implementing their policies well, what parts of the organization are not doing so well, so that one can focus resources. Really, that completes what I wanted to talk about today. That talks you through our approach to zero trust through data discovery. It talks you through how we think of not only CISA's fifth pillar of data, but also the challenges laid out in M2209 and the executive memorandum around establishing zero trust. And it talks to you about some of the challenges around technology, how we think one should look at data discovery and the maintenance of an inventory so that one can not only apply zero trust principles, but one can be more creative and, dare I say, assertive with the way one handles particularly challenging data environments, the new ones brought into scope by the memorandum. And I'm just highlighting there the need to sustain that implementation on an ongoing basis with a flexible approach that doesn't rely on end-user classification, and also provides scalable workflows and visualization so that one can address more challenging scalable problems and not lean all of your zero trust and governance requirements on the shoulders of overburdened users. Jack, I think that's everything. Shall I hand back to you?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that, Rich. We got a couple questions here in the chat. So we'll go ahead and read through some of those if you have a second. So could you get into the role that records management might play in building out a successful zero trust architecture?
Well, this is one of my favorite questions, actually, Jack. And if I'm asking this and sounding a little bit kind of obsequious to maybe a record manager's asking the question, I really mean this. But I'm also going to be quite direct on how I think record management has fared over the last 10 or 15 years. I'll try and be quick. When I first got involved in data, I met record managers who were still dealing with filing cabinets. And they were really struggling to come to terms with the digitization of work. And they were frankly disenfranchised and disempowered. The thing is, record managers get these things. They get not only sensitivity, but I pointed out the information type record classification requirements here. And so I think record managers have a real opportunity. Record managers care. Record managers can become the heart of this classification and discovery challenge, which I think M2209 really opens up in considering the broader scope of data. And so I also think in many federal agencies, record managers were around and available to do this work. I will be careful because I know record managers are busy, but I think this is a critical part of where record management can grow its thinking. And if one attends an ARMA, you can see some of this growth an ARMA environment, the Association of Record Managers. You can see a record management beginning to get to grips with these challenges. But I do think I would put record management as one of the key operators in this type of implementation, particularly in the types of workflow, the types of data environments that move beyond packaged data sets and into these more, as I said, these wilder data sets. Hopefully that answers the question, Jack, unless you think there's something I missed.
No, yeah, that was great. And it kind of does lead into the next question. So would you be confident in saying that unstructured data is less secure than structured data?
Yeah, I would actually. This, as I suggested when I talked about my experience in the Royal Air Force, I was deeply frustrated by the fact that I felt that the lion's share of data was simply ignored. I totally get and I understand the focus on packaged data sets and particular products. I really mean that, and has been an appropriate approach. But I was so excited to see M2209 pull this out explicitly, and the fact here is that users just do stuff. I can't put it more simply than that. And they go and do stuff. And no matter how good the underlying repository is at applying some of the stopgap measures it affords, users do weird stuff. They take things out of the repository, they manipulate it in different ways, they move to another repository, and then they come back inside. So users do all sorts of stuff. It's the root of that challenge that I think requires that one goes broad in one's thinking of these wild data sources, that one considers specialist technology to really implement and address these unstructured data environments. And that behavior is the sort of stuff that's meat and drink to threat actors and to when there are breaches, and examples of things we found, password files, with credentials in the clear. And I appreciate that some zero trust types of implementation perhaps remove that type of threat, but the users will need to do other things that will circumvent zero trust principles. And so I do think that one can't anticipate what users will do next. So one needs to consider these unstructured data sources as really important to get a grip of. And our experience is that when one does do a good discovery of these types of data, one finds stuff that unfortunately one gets quite alarmed about, but when you think about this kind of plausible deniability, now plausible deniability is no longer a good hiding place. You've got to kind of take a deep breath, go find out what's out there, and then get your executive team aligned so that you can invest in a plan that addresses the problem. And as I made the point in my sort of consciously competent space, you don't have to solve the problem all at once, but you should really know what the problem is as part of the zero trust approach.
Right. And so last question, and unless anybody else has got one more to add. So our agency has unique CUI categories, and we're aware that users might not always select the right category of CUI when applying the label to the document. So how could classification be used to discover CUI content? Could you talk about that?
Thank you for that. This is an important element here. Let's face it, you've got to love users. And I say that from my heart, because these are the people that deliver much of the value in our organizations. But users will do the best thing they can, and often that results in an inappropriate classification for CUI or anything else. The trivial example I'll talk about is in an organization that works with geospatial data. And my point being that geospatial information is one of the most important elements of this organization. Lost track of the number of the times I found data tagged with Afghanistan because it's the first on the list. And I don't want to sort of minimize that or trivialize it. It's really very important. So classification's got two roles here. I'd say even three. I may make up four as I go through this. First of all, classification consistently applies the organization's view of the classification that should be applied. Users, no matter how much you train them, are not going to take that consistent view. They're going to come up with what they think. And I appreciate that one should trust users on this, but I don't think that's acceptable here. And I don't think you should have to ask users to do that. So I think classification first provides consistent classification of these documents at scale without bothering the user's workflow. Secondly, classification should enable analysts, record managers to check back on classification rates, success rates, and the like, so that one can monitor the state of the system. And that's importantly and critically not a user role, but is a utility of a good inventory. The third point I'd make is classification can be set up to start to spot inappropriate classification. And even the logic for that can be quite difficult to implement, and certainly the technology can be challenging. But if we're given the right visualization, good analysts, good record managers can spot poor classification activities and start to address training and approach ways in which they can improve classification. So I think those are the three parts of classification. I think three there about how classification can be involved. First of all, applying classification consistently based on the organization's view rather than the user's view. Secondly, spotting and monitoring classification success across the organization and filling up gaps. And then thirdly, working towards reducing false classification or addressing gaps. If you think about user classification, if data changes, the user is likely not to change the classification, and beginning to spot those gaps comes out of this process too.
Very good. I couldn't agree more that users should stick to their day job and let the experts in technology do the classification and tagging.
As a user yourself, Jack, I wouldn't think of asking you to classify a document.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. All right, so that concludes today's webinar. Again, we'll be sending out a recording to those who are in attendance and those who signed up. So look forward to that. And that is all. Thanks everybody for your time today, and look forward to chatting in the future.
Jack.